morning, everybody. I'm going to do something a little risky. This is going to be a great meeting talking about policy and strategy. And I want to begin a little differently with a chance for you to talk about personal narrative. So a little introduction, and then we'll get into it. There's no doubt that America needs a dramatically different mobility dynamic to advance and achieve equity. We all are familiar with the research that's revealed profound stickiness for people born to families at the bottom of the income distribution. And these stunted possibilities contradict the standard American narrative of personal economic advancement that most of us in this room have probably experienced firsthand. So we clearly need a new formula, a change in systems, policy, practice, and culture in order for mobility to flourish and to generate the equity that America longs for so desperately. Story and personal narrative can offer us a refreshing way to identify and explore the critical factors that drive and expand upward economic mobility. They can also remind us that upward mobility is in fact possible. So I'd like, before we begin our policy and strategy discussions, to invite you to think about your mobility story by sharing part of mine. And as I do, I hope you will look past its particularities to the universal elements that this story illustrates as you reflect on what may have contributed to your family's upward trajectory. So I want you to meet Lillian and Norris. Lillian's grandfather, Stanton, was a slave in Richmond, Virginia. In the early 1850s, after 2 failed attempts at escape, his mistress allowed him to buy his freedom. He hightailed it to the Underground Railroad, exhilarated and determined, and traveled to its endpoint in Chatham, Ontario. And there he used his skills as a carpenter and a brick mason to lay an independent economic foundation for his family and to help John Brown plan his ill-fated raid on Harper's Ferry. One of Stanton's sons made it to Wilberforce University in Ohio. Lillian, his oldest granddaughter, perhaps influenced by that uncle, caught the college bug and entered and graduated from Fisk University, another HBCU established expressly to forge a new leadership class from the descendants of slaves like her grandfather. Lillian graduated in 1908. This is her graduation picture. One of a second generation of free blacks to be educated there, and then moved to Detroit to educate the next generation. Norris's grandfather was a free man of color also in Richmond. His son moved to the more hospitable city of Washington, D.C. as a young adult and started his family. Norris grew into adolescence in the early 20th century, surrounded by a community culture that, although deeply segregated, brimmed with opportunities for African Americans. Chief among the formative institutions was Dunbar High School, the first public school in the country for African Americans. Many of Dunbar's faculty had advanced degrees, but because Jim Crow segregation prevented their using those degrees in the broader labor market, these academically accomplished folks taught high school, making Dunbar a hotbed of excellent instruction and post-secondary aspirations for working and middle-class blacks for 3 generations. When Norris aspired to go to a good college, Dunbar's social networks arranged for a postgraduate study year at Phillips Exeter Academy to ensure his proper preparation. And from there, Norris gained admission to the University of Michigan, spending summers as a cook on the Pennsylvania Railroad to pay for school. He graduated with a degree in chemistry and then, on a fateful trip to Detroit, the Silicon Valley of industrial America, he met Lillian. Now, you've probably guessed by now that Lillian and Norris are close to me. They are, in fact, my paternal grandparents. And their mobility story, spurred by desperate and ambitious forebears, nurtured by family and communities with high aspirations, catapulted forward by educational institutions tailor-made to forge talent from a deliberately neglected racial minority, is both deeply particular and profoundly universal. Their life course enabled their grandson, David, to end up in college as the classmate of Hilary Pennington. Now, as we say in the South, that is tall cotton indeed. But the story of Lillian and Norris is also painfully poignant. They were aberrations at a time when their generational and racial peers were held back by harsh Jim Crow policies and a culture of deliberate disinvestment and discrimination. Radical upward mobility such as theirs was selective and exceptional. So let's just look for a second at some of the factors that advanced mobility for Lillian Norris. They had personal drive by the bucketful. They were nurtured by a culture of aspiration and urgency within family and community. They benefited from launching pad institutions that developed in them confidence and skill. And they had access to an economy that generated opportunity for educated people. Now, some things were missing in that story. There was not a prevailing commitment to racial justice and equity. The headwinds they and others faced were colossal. There wasn't a strong infrastructure of opportunity, a well-aligned system of institutions that made the most of individual programs. There wasn't that aligning, supportive infrastructure, well-aligned, purpose-built to lift people to a different place at scale. There was not supportive public policy to make advancement universal. It was selective and heavily triggered by luck and good fortune. And there were also other factors that I think you're going to have a chance to talk about in a minute. So I want to ask you, just to get your voices into this mix early and do a little early morning post-prandial, I guess we say, post-grit conversation. Talk to your neighbor for a second. What's your mobility story? Who were your Norris and Lillian? Perhaps you're Norris, or perhaps you're Lillian. And what factors, similar or different from the ones that advanced my grandparents, helped or hindered that narrative of yours? So take a few minutes, talk to your neighbors, and we'll shout out what you learn and discover. And we'll do it too. 1 minute. So clearly, this is energizing. Give me one or two things that I didn't mention quickly, shout it out, that were critical factors in advancing mobility in your story. One or two things. Yell it out. I can hear it. Social networks. Mentors, parental advice. I didn't hear that last one. Immigration. Okay. The GI Bill, maybe in some of yours. Good. So what I want you to do is keep this tape running in your heads and keep saying what made a difference. Clearly, this is energizing, and I hope this reflection is powerful. So I want to leave you with this question that I hope will be an earworm during this entire conference. How do we make the factors that support upward mobility present and sustainable in the lives of people and living at the bottom rungs of the income and opportunity ladder? What have we seen? What have we learned? What do we believe is possible? Because I believe this is really our quest. Thanks for a good beginning to what will be a great conversation, and I'm turning this back over to the moderator to bring us back under control. Thank you.
That's a difficult man to follow. You know already that I'm British, so one of the challenges of my job is I talk about class and class structures to American audiences with this accent. So so you've already done some of the job for me. I always kind of start by saying, so I live in America now, I have a green card, my kids are American, my wife's American, I'm becoming an American citizen, and I was born on the 4th of July. True, that's true. Which is true, and who knew that would be so great? But maybe it was meant to be. So I'm going to throw some data at you from work that we do at Brookings and elsewhere, and then an idea. So some facts and then an idea, and I'm going to try and do it as quickly as possible. So economic mobility is one of those terms, even perhaps as much as opportunity, that means everything to everybody. It can mean lots of different things. So there is a need to be clear what we're talking about at a particular moment in time. So I'm just going to do a bit of differentiation between absolute mobility and relative mobility. Bear with me, it's an important distinction. So absolute mobility is, are you better off than your parents were at the same age? Say in terms of income. So you're 40, are you better off in material terms than your parents were when they were 40? That's quite often what people are talking about. Talking about, oh, I'm better off than my parents were. But the thing is, as you see from this chart, this is Pew data, not mine, 84% of Americans are better off than their parents were at the same age. And even more so if they were raised in the bottom quintile. Quintile is the bottom 20%, even more so because obviously they could go up from where their parents were. But it would be extraordinary if that number weren't that high, really, because economies grow a lot in 40 years. And so actually that's just a reflection, to my mind, it's a reflection of economic growth and the way that it's shared. The US has been very good at absolute mobility in much of the post-war period. Between 1950 and 1974, 1973, the US economy grew by 4% a year on average. You grow by 4% a year for a quarter of a century, yeah, most people are going to be better off. This is not to say that there weren't huge problems, but there's this kind of rising tide, okay? So that's the absolute mobility. There's another form of mobility, which is where are you on the ladder compared to where your parents were on the ladder, which is what we call relative mobility. This is the sticky ends that we talked about before. And this, again, we're breaking the population up into quintiles, 20%. Here the question we're asking is, if you are born or raised in a family at the bottom, in the bottom 20%, where do you end up as an adult at roughly the same age? This is the best mobility picture you're going to see. Most data sets give you less mobility than this, but in the interest of fairness, I'm putting up this one. So this shows you about 4 in 10 people born poor, 36% on there, it's a bit more than that, stay poor, and only 10%, and it's probably less than that, make it to the top, right? So those corners, bottom left-hand corner, is the stickiness, the intergenerational persistence of inequality. And for me, that's the most morally offensive form of inequality there is. It is the inheritance of inequality that is immoral, and particularly in the US. But that overall picture, there's a lot of difference within the population. That's the whole US, big country, hard to know what's going on. So I'm just going to go very quickly through some other charts which break that down a bit. And I think there are 4 factors that it's worth looking at, just descriptively. Family, education, race, and geography. And then I'm going to offer an idea at the end. Family. So we have descriptive data on the marital status of the mother of kids as they're growing up. There's a lot of data here, I apologize. The basic story here is that if your mother was never married, that's the bottom left-hand side, and you're born in the bottom 20%, you've got more than a odds chance of staying there. Versus continuously married mothers who are in the middle, where there's much more mobility. Now, I'm not controlling for anything here, it's just descriptive. And for the record, it's not the marriage in and of itself, it's what tends to go along with that seems to be doing the work. But nonetheless, descriptively, it's there. And in a very big study, which I'll talk about in a moment, by Raj Chetty, the strongest correlate, 2 strongest correlates with lack of upward mobility in US cities were proportion of single mothers and level of racial segregation. So there's something going on family, and I should say that it's family stability that seems to be doing the work. And in the US, structure and stability are very strongly related to each other. Education, right, this is probably more relevant to you. These are people who drop out of high school. Again, same quintiles. It says quartiles, I apologize, it's a typo. So you're born in the bottom 20% and you drop out of high school, 54% chance of staying at the bottom and a 1% chance of getting to the top. Basically, you're stuck, right? We kind of know that. Then high school, quite a bit better. 4-year college graduates. So look again at this bottom quintile, let's say quintile. If you're born in the bottom 20% and you get a 4-year college degree, you have a 20% chance of getting to that top quintile, to go from the bottom to the top, Horatio Alger style, a 16% chance of being stuck at the bottom. So education, and particularly kind of post-secondary education, you see similar trend with 2-year college as well. That's the big mobility lifter. Compare that to no high school. On the other hand, the people born at the top, look at the right-hand side, who drop out of high school, 16% of them drop to the bottom. compared to 16% of those born at the bottom who get a four-year college degree. So yes, education matters, but it certainly doesn't wipe out background. Problem, of course, is so very, very few of the kids at the bottom are getting a four-year college degree or anything like it. It's not that it doesn't work, it's that they're not getting it. Race. You can't talk about economic mobility in the US without talking about race. And you particularly can't talk about it without talking about the extraordinary differences for black and white Americans. Sorry? So this is black versus white mobility rates. Same chart, hopefully you're getting the hang of the chart now. Black Americans, if you're born in the bottom 20% and you're black, 51% chance of being stuck there. 1% chance of getting to the top. 33% chance of getting to the top. Go over to white. You're white and you're born at the bottom, 23% chance of being stuck at the bottom, 16% chance of getting to the top. Twice as likely to be stuck in poverty if you're born in poverty if you're black compared to white. Now look at the middle quintile. That's the only time I'm going to ask you to do that. Middle quintile. Born into the middle of the income distribution. If you're black, you have a 70% chance of being downwardly mobile relative to your parents if you're black, by comparison to the whites, where it's 20% and 14%. So take away from that, if you're black, twice as likely to be stuck in poverty, twice as likely to fall out of the middle class. This is having a huge effect on the overall numbers. You'll notice that there isn't a quintile for black Americans at the top on the left-hand side because there weren't enough black Americans in the top quintile for me to do the analysis. So the fact that we can now do a top quintile is progress of a sort. Geography, massive variations between different areas. This is not my data, this is Raj Chetty's data. Raj Chetty, now at Stanford, is the leading scholar in this field. His work is a must follow if you're interested in this. And this is a slightly different measure of mobility, but the basic message is the darker the color, the less mobility there is. So the dark areas are the least mobile, and you probably recognize the map. And I've said already that there is a strong association with race, race segregation, and family structure, as well as school quality and social capital in his studies. So there is massive variation. Some of the places with the light colors, they have the same mobility rates as Scandinavia. It's the South and some of the Rust Belt where poverty is persistent. And then I promised to leave you with an idea, and I apologize how quick this has been. I think actually Maria said earlier about a linear track. One of the things I want us to think about is the difference in the ways you can get from A to B, that you can make it to the middle class or you can escape from poverty. Right now we have, and I'm borrowing from Joey Fishkin's book, Bottlenecks here, superb book. We have a unitary opportunity structure, like the picture on the right. You've got to follow a quite narrow path, and if you fall off it, you're in trouble. And in the work that I do, I sometimes encourage that by talking about college, education, etc. And what we need to do is continue to think about that, but what we need is something more like what's on the left. Multiple second, third, fourth chances, on-ramps, different routes, different ways to get ahead. What we need is opportunity pluralism rather than a unitary opportunity structure. So multiple pathways that can get people out, rather than assuming that everybody can go along the same line. That is very difficult to do, but I think we've got to think more pluralistically about opportunity rather than just focusing on one. Thank you.
So it's really a joy to be here, and I just have to say, as a parent of Jobs for the Future, to experience what every parent hopes, that way beyond the dreams of Arthur and I when we started JFF, it has, due to the extraordinary team, just gone on to exceed every possible expectation we could have had. So I'm not going to show you any slides. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I think we are and how far and big the gap is between where we are and where we need to get. And I'm going to use as my reference point a landmark report that changed how the country saw 16 to 24-year-olds called The Forgotten Half that came out in 1988, only a couple of years after JFF started, and reflect on three questions. The first is, how far have we come since 1988? What's changed? And what do we know now that we didn't know then that could help us get further? And I'm going to start out with just reading a quote from The Forgotten Half. Who are the forgotten half? In non-statistical terms, they are the young people who build our homes, drive our buses, repair our automobiles, serve our schools and hospitals, and keep the production lines of our mills and factories moving. To a great extent, they determine how well the American family, economy, and democracy function. They are also the thousands of young men and women who aspire to work productively but never quite make it to that kind of employment. For these members of the forgotten half, their lives of adults start in the economic limbo of unemployment, part-time jobs, and poverty wages. Many of them never break free. Does that sound familiar to where we are today? I think it does. But what is really, really sobering is that by almost every measure, young adults are worse off today than they were in 1988. They have lower earnings, median earnings. Their rates of employment are less than they were, with young people in their 20s, unemployment being almost 2 times the national average. There's a bigger gap between the assets that they have, between them and people who are over 65. 20, 30 years ago, it was about 10 to 1, and today it's 47 to 1 because of things like college debt and unemployment. More of them are living with their parents, 30% today, and way more of them are delaying family formation and have never married. And that's gone from 40% to 60% today. One bright statistic in all of this is they've increased their post-secondary attainment. But as Richard was showing us just a moment ago, inequality remains strong by race and class in post-secondary attainment. And most of the growth comes from young people who are in the top quintiles of the earnings gaining post-secondary education. They've gone from 40% to 83% of them getting a BA by the time they're 24 years old, where since 1970, the numbers of young people in the bottom quartile who gain a BA by the time they're 24-year-old have stayed absolutely flat at about 8 to 10%. So that's a sobering picture. And why? What has changed? Many things, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about. The economy has changed in ways that outsource risk onto individuals. Our demography has changed. And we have, as both of David and Richard talked about, built-in structural discrimination in public policies in our country that has made it harder for the rising demographics of the United States, the majority-minority young people coming of age, to get ahead. From housing policy that has caused residential segregation, that means our schools are more segregated than they were when the Brown decision was laid down, to policies of mass incarceration through which we've lost a generation. So big things, big structural things, but I want to turn to a couple of things that I think we need to think more about. And I didn't really look at the program structure or the structure of the conference before doing these remarks. So this is a little bit orthogonal. Maybe it'll be a little bit provocative for what we are about to do over the next couple of days. But I want to talk about 3 lessons for why we are where we are and why we've gotten less far than we need to get. The first lesson is that we at the vanguard of these kinds of changes have stayed fixed too long on an outdated kind of theory of change. If you look back at the forgotten half, it was a period of time when you could write, a task force could write a big report, a commission could write a big report, they could issue that report, they could build a coalition of civil society, business, and government leaders, and start to work on kind of proof points or demonstrations that showed the way to something different and that could begin to change state and federal policy. And what that did inadvertently was to privilege elites and to sideline everyone else, young people, workers, families, students. And as a result, we got policy changes without understanding the need for local ownership of those policy changes and local capacity to be able to implement and bring about change. And that has been a contributing factor to things like the loss of support for the Common Core standards. If you look at, for example, even how in the last 20 years we've used data. We've used data for accountability purposes, primarily, not to really build communities of practice that can use that data and information to strengthen and improve what they do and how they do it through a set of metrics that they have designed and they have owned that help them, as Tony Brike says, get better at getting better. So that's the first lesson I would take. The second is related to it, and that is that our strategies have been primarily technical strategies, organizational strategies about models, when in fact the challenges and the work is political and structural and cultural, and has required adaptive responses. And we have believed that if we could build it, if we could demonstrate it, then the change would come. And that has turned out, I think, by and large, not to be true. And it has led us to focus very, very much on models, on proof points, on scaling, and on best practices. And yet, those models and best practices have not coalesced into a new normal for how to build the infrastructure for opportunity and advancement. And in fact, they often have ended up confusing the public and funders by competing for attention and resources and credibility. So that's the second lesson. Third lesson, and I think in many, many ways this is the most important. We underestimated the power of the opposition and the counter-narrative that they would build, and we didn't build our own counter-narrative. While we were focused on proof points and best practices and scaling, they were focused on very powerful oppositional messages that were clean and clear and aimed at beliefs and values. Bad teachers, bad schools, bad government, incompetent government, broken systems. And it was very easy to go from those kinds of messages to structural changes that led to privatization, competition, accountability in some instances gone rogue without sufficient attention to building communities of practice and locally owned capability. So here we are. We are, if you think about where we are now and you see it playing out in Brexit and in the presidential election, we are at a moment when evidence, much of what we all believe in, is highly contested, and it doesn't end up winning the day. And we are learning that people pay attention to what they believe already. It's very hard for evidence to change the deep-seated beliefs that people have about the way the world should work and therefore how we should put our public priorities. And we have deep national and ideological divides. So I would suggest that as we go through the next few days focusing on things like scaling and evidence, we also add to our consideration three things. How would we think about changing the rules of the game? How do we think about power dynamics? And how do we think about changing beliefs and underlying belief structures? On the rules of the game, it is no wonder that people who are afraid and buffeted by the amount of economic uncertainty do not find it particularly reassuring when we say that skill development is the way forward for them, even though there is a lot of truth to that. And it's equally important to focus on rules, fundamental rules of the game. And it's wonderful that you've got an attention to this through Raise the Floor and the National Domestic Workers Alliance and others that are going to be here. But these are things like working conditions, like the need to dramatically modernize our social protection and our employment protection systems, the need to think about whether we need some kind of national youth employment policy. So rules of the game, I would posit, are things we have to really begin to think about and take much more strongly. Second, power dynamics. We have to figure out how to make our diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, our strength and source of power. And we have to put young people at the center. But we need to prepare and support them to move from protest to power and to spend a lot more time thinking about how we do that. And then finally, in terms of power dynamics, to figure out how a network of local activism, local actors, can interact with national, state, and federal policy, and how we can lift up the wisdom of powerful communities of practice that are distributed as a powerful mechanism for creating distributed and deep change. And then last, beliefs. We have to figure out how to come to the essential, we have to pay better attention to the essential things that people have come to believe, and we have to focus on changing the narrative. Changing cultural narratives that exclude, lifting up narratives that validate things that are also true about this country, our belief in equity, our belief in opportunity, our belief in human dignity. So we have our work cut out for us. I look forward to the conversation and all the innovation that you all will contribute over these next couple of days. Thank you.
So those were three really, really stimulating presentations. If I could summarize what I heard, and then I'll turn to the panel to react. Essentially, it came in three parts. One part was a set of facts. So we got facts about low levels of mobility from Richard. And we also got a set of facts or a statement, which I think is absolutely correct, from Hilary, that if you look at the data, things have not improved, and in fact, in many respects, things have worsened over time. Richard's data was point in time, but Hilary gave us a dynamic, in effect, a time series, and things have not improved. We then got kind of a list of causes. And these are a list of causes such as education, geography, family culture, personal drive. And these lists of causes were cross-hatched by race. So you'd have the list of causes, and then you've got race as a factor that it's just inevitable to think. It forces us to think about it because it's pervasive in our society. And then Hilary talked about a completely different theme, which I personally am very committed to, which has to do with the role of politics and power and structure. So that's kind of what I thought I heard. The issue that I want to pose to the panel, and I'd like each of you to kind of respond to that, is if that's a fair kind of summary of where we're at, one way to think about how to proceed would be we need to improve the school system. Another way to think about how to proceed would be we need to encourage people to move from low mobility geographies to higher mobility geographies. Another way to think about how to proceed is we need to focus on the economy, the opportunity structure that's out there. David talked about his family moving to Detroit. That was an opportunity structure that we may not have now. And Hilary talked about organizing, essentially political organizing, and in some fundamental, deeper sense, messaging, coming up with messages. Where do we begin? How do we think about where to begin? How do we think about what we should be doing today and tomorrow? So why don't we begin, just go left to right, Richard, David, Hilary, and kind of give us a strategy, give us some steps.
So we could pick up some of what you've said. I thought it was a very good summary. I have to say, correlation's not causation. Around the kind of causes, but the patterns are very strong. I think I'm really struck by the apparent gap between my boring facts and Hilary's stirring call, to change values. And actually, what happens is, it's not that we don't know, by and large, what kinds of things we should be doing. It is that there isn't a sufficient commitment to actually pursuing equality of opportunity as if we really meant it, okay? Because when it comes to it, the individualism of American culture, which I think is necessary and unchanged, doesn't get balanced by the egalitarianism of American culture. So those two aspects of American culture, they've become unbalanced in my view. And so you can sit here having this conversation about education and so on, and then I go to Charlotte where I'm doing some work, where they're trying to change school admissions policies to prevent some of this segregation. 2,000 upper middle class parents turn out to protest because the kids will have a longer bus ride, or they're worried about neighborhood schools and kind of all the rest of it. So I think this issue of power, like, you can policy wonk for the next few days, but there's a broader commitment here, which is, do we mean it or not? Right? If we're actually a meritocracy, how can you possibly have a post-secondary education system as it's currently designed, with legacy admissions at one end and appalling resources at the other end? I mean, it's unconscionable if we're serious. So I think that's what I'm left with almost. I know it's not an answer, but it's like, are we serious or not? And until we can answer that question, and you're right, Hilary, unless we win that values thing, the wonky stuff just dribbles away.
Thank you. Dave?
No.
No. Turn David on, please.
I don't know how to. Is it on now? Yeah, okay. So I live and work in the red part of America. And what I experience is, on a daily basis, is paradox. Because at some level, at high levels, there is the narrative of scarcity and fear. And many of our legislatures have been captured by that and are trying to legislate that, it seems to be, into permanence. But at the same time, at the metropolitan level around the South, that reddest of the nation with respect to mobility, there are incredible coalitions of business leaders and education leaders coming together to fundamentally change dynamics which they find, to use Richard's words, immoral and dangerous. So they're putting tens of millions of dollars on the table to reimagine and rebuild those kind of multiple pathway systems, starting very early and leading to the connection with entry-level work. So if you believe people are putting their leadership and energy where they believe something can happen, in the reddest of states, there is a fundamental dissatisfaction on the part of many leaders about these patterns, and they are trying to change it. So the challenge of that is those are isolated. The strength of it is they're real, and to do that work depends on deep interpersonal, inter-system relationships of trust that are putting life into excellent models. So I see perhaps it's a rebuilding of the opportunity infrastructure from the bottom up, and where that is happening successfully, it is engaging people who create jobs, major employers, with education system leaders, and very often with young people themselves, to reimagine what an opportunity structure can look like. And the question for me is, how do we nurture that still fairly isolated work and have it to cohere into larger statewide systems that can move more people? But it isn't entirely bleak if you look from the bottom level up.
Right. Hilary?
Yeah, I agree with what David is saying. I think a lot of the hope is what's happening at the local level, and I agree with Richard as well. I think what I would just add is I think we all have to spend a lot more time understanding what people are really afraid of. You know, I think it's easy because we believe that we are right and to skip over what they are so afraid of. And I think that until and unless we can really, you know, in a real and a respectful way engage that, we can't get to where we want to get in terms of the sort of multiple pathways. And I think there is just such a need for narrative, for different kinds of narrative strategies that help people understand what we share in common. You know, to me, one of the great miracles really and successes is what's happened with the marriage equality movement. You know, but there are things like that go to deeply shared common values that movement was able to lift up, and it had many setbacks, and it did also do political things and organizing kinds of things. But I think we have to start with sort of understanding what people are afraid of and then reframing. Because I would agree with you, Richard. You know, the technical things we know. We know enough about what works and what the public policies should be. The problem is getting there to be the will to adopt them.
So let me press you on these points, though. So we've got here 650 people who are running programs, right? And we've invested a lot in programs. We know what good programs look like, what best practice looks like. How can you integrate delivering programs, because that's with organizing around these themes, so that programs become a channel for building power?
Right.
I've had experience with that
Right.
personally.
Yeah, you should talk about that,
Quite
Paul.
a bit. Well, I'm not being paid. You guys are being paid for this.
They are?
If you want, I'll renegotiate my deal.
We all will.
But I have had experience
Yeah.
with that, right? In which you use job training programs in particular, but there's other kinds of programs out there. There's housing programs, there's transportation, as a mechanism for bringing people together and building the kind of power that you're talking about. That, I think, talking a little bit about that, I think would have practical meaning to this, because this is not a political organizing conference, but I share the message. I agree with that we need to have that. How can you integrate the two strategies? Do you have any thoughts on that question? Anybody?
Well, you should speak again, and I'll just maybe I'll just start by saying I think part of how you do it is just to recognize that you need to do it. That just running the programs themselves and showing that they work is not in and of itself going to get where you need to get, and really analyzing the power structures in the places where you are, whether it's the composition of your state legislature or the power structures in your cities, and making common cause with allies that have strength political organizing. You know, this is, again, I think, why some of the kind of confluence of thinking about caregiving or what it means to have living wages together with what it takes to have the skills to occupy those kinds of jobs. You know, so I think part of it is just is understanding that that has to be part of the work, and it's not enough to stand on the evidence alone or the structural things alone. And then there are good mechanisms for that, and they exist in many places. And what to me is so striking now that I work in a foundation that works on many different aspects of the opportunity and inequality challenge is in any place in the country, there are many, many, many different groups that are really essentially working towards the same thing, but they just don't talk to each other, and they don't do that work together, and each is so concerned about the lack of resources for their own thing that they don't coalesce. So I would say that that's a place to start.
Yeah, I would, most of my work is at the local and regional level, and I think a step one is having an analysis that helps people see the system as a whole and see where the gaps in it are. That sounds kind of basic, but if every system's perfectly designed to produce the results it gets, why are these results being repeated over and over again? I think to have a way to see that analysis and discuss it at a table where leaders represent all points of the system we're trying to change is absolutely necessary. What I'm talking about is some form of organizing that leads to a leadership table that is representative of all the relevant parts of the system, particularly two elements that often aren't there: employers, and in the case of young people themselves. So there's a table where a candid analysis of culture and system can take place, and where people can work at a scale where they believe they can make a difference to begin to shift these. I get, frankly, paralyzed when I think of trying to have this work happen in one giant gulp at a national scale. It feels as if there's a regionalism that is necessary. How can we get our hands on the levers of the systems to show that we can begin to rebuild them in a way within our power? Just like organizing begins one-on-one, there's sort of an analogy to that. And the question I have is, how long do we have, given these pressures, to work at that gradual bottom-up level? Can we get there in time to shift the numbers that Richard talked about? But I think there's power, and there already is movement in trying to build these tables of whole system analysis with the people who can actually make it change, and that's a way forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open it up to the peanut gallery. That expression shows my age. That was from, anybody out there remember Howdy Doody?
I've heard of it.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I want to say one thing, one substantive thing, which is I have seen programs which are effective programs, but which take as part of their mission involving the people they're working with in designing the program and fighting for the resources, and in supporting the people who are in the program and engaging in a set of activities that essentially becomes both delivering programs and political education. And that's what I'm trying to get at, that you can do both, and you can do both effectively, and that's how you both build power and deliver effective programs. So I hope we have the technology for people to ask questions. We have about 6 or 7 minutes. I think the way to do this is for people to collect 2 or 3 questions, and I'm begging you not to make a speech, but to ask a succinct question or two. And of course, I can't see, now I can see you. Does anybody want to stand up and either, there's a microphone I can see, and pose a couple of succinct questions to the panel based on what we've heard?
Good morning. My name is Monica Allman. I'm with the Alliance for Excellent Education. Thank you so much for this very thoughtful panel this morning. Sometimes when you go to conferences, you think you're going to hear the same thing, and that's not the case this morning. So the call to really rethink kind of ideology and beliefs, I mean, I think that's the core of this work, really. I mean, there's so many divides in this country, as we all know. How do you kind of advocate for that and get that to resonate with policymakers who are very much interested, especially at the federal level. They're very much interested in seeing data and seeing outcomes according to the work that we do, even though I still believe there are beliefs that prevent them from thinking outside of the box and from really meeting the needs of students and of young adults. So how do we get that message in places like, you know, legislative houses all across the country and even Congress in DC? How do we amplify that message to them? That evidence is important, but there are deep-seated issues that need to be addressed. How do we kind of bring that message to them?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask for two more questions, and you have to remember what those questions were. Another question out there, folks? Somebody? Yes, sir.
I'll just shout it out so that at least you can hear. What about the role of the decline of labor unions as one of the tools that we used to have? And with the decline of labor unions, we have less of a tool to speak out for working people than we used to have.
Fair. One more question, and then we'll turn it over. None of you people are going to have any mobility if you can't think of a good question. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Hi, Celeste Jam with Third Sector Capital Partners. And I was just curious, getting back to the comment about, do we mean it as a meritocracy or do we mean it in terms of equality? And it feels like a lot of the programs focus on a population that we think needs fixing, but then we don't address the structural privilege that exists. And so, you know, I think bringing in employers could be one way to do it, but as we think of broader solutions, how do we address, you know, white privilege, class privilege, in terms of actually creating equality?
Great. So 3 questions. One is, how do you get the message across effectively? Second question is the role of unions and worker representation, and I would broaden that to include new forms of worker voice as well as traditional unions. And the third question is, how do you deal with larger kind of social structures such as race and class privilege? So why don't we go down, Richard, David, Hilary, and take that.
So I probably won't attempt to answer all of them given the time, but so the unions one, I think it's a great example of an institution that used to act as countervailing power, and those institutions are virtually dead in the private sector. I don't tend to the view that there's a renaissance likely around unions, so there's a gap. So the question becomes this question of power. How do employees or potential employees have more power in the labor market where unions in the private sector have basically gone? There's lots of answers to that: basic income, employee ownership, skills, etc. But I think it does kind of speak to this question of power, which actually relates to the other 2 points as well. I think that we need to think about diversity in terms of class as much now as gender, certainly, and race. It's happening a lot in the UK now, where we're capturing data on class background. And I think that if you're serious about diversity, given everything we've heard about and we know about mobility, you know, the truth is that you can sometimes get more diversity by a third-generation poor white man raised in Appalachia, as you can from people who look very diverse but actually got very similar backgrounds. So just not in any sense we shouldn't keep pushing on those other forms of privilege. But I think that the growing problem in the US is class privilege. That's the growing problem. Not to say it's the only problem, but growing problem. And this issue of changing the narrative and power at a local level, I agree, this kind of politicization of technocracy. Technocracy won't do on its own. So how do you kind of small p politicize these efforts? I agree it's local. But I think we've got quite a long way to go. And my last comment on this will be, sometimes some of us will have to give something up. This is not necessarily always win-win. Power, money, access are all things that we want. And sometimes creating a more equal society requires some of us, including probably most of us in this room and those of us on the panel, to give some stuff up. And knowing how hard that is going to be became clear to me last year when President Obama became the first president, I think unprecedented, to pull from his own budget a measure before it even got to the House under pressure from his own party. From liberal members of his own party forced him to pull out of his budget a single measure because of the pressure. That's a Democrat. That measure, reforming 529 college savings plans so that they would become more progressive, right? It was I'm writing a book about this. It was a defining moment for me. I was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Terrible politics. But I'm sorry, if we can't get to a place where we don't think we should be giving up those tax advantages to help other kids get to college, sorry. I'm supposed to be really technocratic. You're not videoing this, are you?
So my answer to the first question about how do we get our message heard is to say think hard about the message and the messenger and the framing of the case to be made, which I think does involve elements of data, of a moral case. There are multiple messages that have to be articulated. For instance, living and working in the red zone, the bloody southeast on that map, you learn quickly that you can talk about opportunity, but you can't talk about equity. So you need to have a variety of, I call them Trojan horse narratives that can get you in the door to be able to make a case so that ultimately people will see a revealed truth that their own frames don't allow them to. So a lot of smart and smarter work has to go into framing a narrative that gets progressive ideas in the door. And that means, I think that comes about by having forums where the technocrats and real folk come together to say, what is the persuasive narrative that we can use to have what's a narrow conversation become broader? There's an art to that, and I think we've got to learn how to practice it, so we're not just speaking in the cave of winds to ourselves.
Okay.
And then there's the question of who carries the message. When you live and work in a realm of the country that seems to be perpetually hostile, that doesn't have labor unions, maybe we become a little more skilled at this. But the Trojan horse strategy, I'll just summarize, really is necessary, undergirded by a narrative that allows people to see and hear a truth that they may not previously have been aware of.
Okay, thank you. Hilary.
So I think you have to be bilingual. You have to do both and, data and power and organizing. I mean, we're defunding programs we know work. Those same legislators that are asking you for evidence are doing that. So I'll just close with a quick example. It's actually an example from South Africa. And it has to do with what it means to put together coalitions that build power and studying what makes things go viral. And this is where young people are such an incredible asset. So in South Africa, they have a constitution that guarantees the right to education. There's a coalition that's evolved of young people, young students, who are using their cell phones to take records of things in their schools, like did their teacher show up to teach them that day? Do they have toilets? Do they have textbooks? That coalition of young people called Equal Education, very passionate, very well organized, has been paired together with a set of universities. And what are those universities doing? They're tracking the flow of money that comes from the national government to the provincial or state governments for things like teacher salaries, textbooks, and toilets. And then they are paired with a very, very powerful legal advocacy group that use their data to bring a case to the Supreme Court. So I think we need things that put it all together like that. I think we need to not think about youth voice as just young people, no offense to young people speaking on panels, but it's putting together those kinds of power structures that use what everybody has to challenge the rules of the game and help make things more equitable and more fair. And the power that they bring, I think, is the galvanizing, game-changing kind of energy. We just have to figure out how to support it better.
So applause to the panel, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Hilary.